The rain had not been invited. It arrived with that quiet, uncooperative independence for which the county was known, ignoring civic arrangements and descending upon the market square in a steady, methodical drizzle that soaked through hats, temperaments, and the more optimistic programs of events. Wetherby and Marsh had planned its memorial evening with the usual confidence of a town certain of its own good taste. A little platform, draped in bunting somewhat faded by history, but not, as yet, by shame. A brass ensemble wavering through a hymn that none of its members entirely approved of, and 12 small white candles set in a careful semicircle before the war memorial. 12, because Wetherby and Marsh liked things to be symmetrical, even in sorrow. The rain, however, showed little respect for symmetry. At first it was mild, a courteous mist, the sort that older ladies referred to as just a touch of wet. Then, as the mayor reached the phrase, "lest we forget," it thickened with intent. Fingers of rain crept down the candles. Flames wavered like the dignity of the town clerk. One by one they died. There was a collective tightening of lips from the assembled crowd, which contained more disapproval of the weather than grief for the departed. A few umbrellas appeared, too late to save the ceremony, but in time to save reputations. And then something occurred which, had it been louder, would have been less disturbing. The final candle did not go out. Rain struck it. Water ran down the wax. The wick bent under the assault, shriveling, guttering, threatening surrender. But the flame remained. It burned with a tiny, deliberate steadiness, a small flame in open defiance of weather, logic, and municipal planning. A murmur moved through the crowd like a ripple of nervous respectability. "That's not natural," whispered Mrs. Hargreaves, who found most things unnatural if they lacked polite explanation. "It's a trick," said Councillor Bell, who distrusted phenomena he could not control by committee. "Must be a special wick," said Mr. Tuffin, the ironmonger, whose profession inclined him towards mechanical solutions to moral discomfort. Only one person moved forward. Miss Dora Pike, secretary to the Women's Upholstery Circle and possessor of a temperament trained upon decades of artificial politeness, stepped off the curb with cautious resolve. She carried no umbrella because she disapproved of fuss. She reached towards the candle. "Best let it be, Dora," murmured someone behind her. But Dora Pike had never let things be. Her fingers closed around the glass chimney. The flame flickered. The glass slipped from her wet grasp. It struck the stone, and it did not shatter. That was the first truly improper thing. The second was the scream. Not Dora's. She was too disciplined for that. But a high, startled, unladylike sound from the edge of the crowd, where Mrs. Elspeth Marrow, treasurer of 3 charitable committees and feared across half the high street, had dropped her handbag into a puddle and discovered that it was very much lighter than it ought to have been. "My letters," she said faintly to the rain. "My private letters." The candle, still burning, lay sideways on the wet cobbles. No one noticed when it quietly slid a few inches, carried by a small stream of rainwater, and came to rest against the heel of a man who had not been on the programme. He wore no badge, no umbrella, and no expression of surprise, only a courteous, speculative calm, as though he had not expected to be present at anything quite so interesting. Inspector Purbright, who had been in Wetherby and Marsh for precisely 7 minutes and already disliked the rain intensely, bent down, picked up the candle, and observed it. The flame went out. Finally. He turned the glass cylinder slowly in his fingers, watching how the last thread of smoke curled inside, refusing for a moment longer to behave as an extinguished thing. "A most determined little light," he said mildly. No one answered. The brass band restarted uncertainly in the wrong key. and the rain, satisfied it had made its point, slightly increased. By the following morning, the rain had the decency to appear apologetic, thinning into a damp, drifting mist which did little to wash away the previous evening's discomfort. Wetherby and Marsh, however, had already begun the more important task of drying its reputation. This was done, as usual, not by facts, but by conversation. The market square smelled faintly of wet stone, extinguished wax, and wounded pride. A stray curl of candle debris lay pressed into a crack between cobbles, like a secret that no one had yet decided how to describe. Brooms had arrived early, wielded with more anxiety than efficiency. In the narrow confines of Tress Leader's tea rooms, gossip had reached a temperature best described as lightly boiling. "It wasn't rain," said Mrs. Hargreaves, stirring her tea with the rigid intensity of a woman determined to produce moral clarity through cutlery. Real rain would have put it out sooner. "Glass that won't break," said Mr. Tuffin, who had placed himself between the radiators and the moral high ground, "is not the sort of glass one encounters in honest trade." No one responded to that directly, as to do so would have required acknowledging that Tuffin's trade was neither fully honest nor fully glass. At a corner table, two members of the parochial organizing committee leaned towards one another like conspirators who had mislaid their own plot. "Did you see her face?" whispered one. "Which her?" "Marrow. You could have held a candle to it." No offence intended. Mrs. Elspeth Marrow at that precise moment was not at the tea-rooms. She had locked herself into her parlour and was lifting every doily, displacing every photograph, and examining the interior of her writing slope with the quiet desperation of a woman whose life was constructed entirely from paper and ink. The letters were gone. There had been several. Not indecent, not illegal, and certainly not entertaining to a third party, but dangerously precise in their observations of other people's habits. She had once referred to them as private reflections. In practice, they were better described as socially lethal. She sat very straight as the reason formed itself. The candle had not been the oddest thing in the square. Across the high street, in the butcher's shop where meats swung with comforting honesty, Councillor Bell was holding court with three men who had no interest in meat and much interest in preventing inconvenience. "We can't have the place looking daft," he said, lowering his voice as one lowers curtains. "Something like that," said a man from the Rotarians. "Implies planning." Bell frowned. "What sort?" "Clever sort." "That's worse." There was immediate comfort in that agreement. By mid-morning the theories had developed in the way only theories born of boredom can. The candle had been explained as chemically treated by someone with too much time, too little respect, and possibly radical sympathies. Dora Pike's dropped glass was being discussed as if it were an act of provocation. The handbag incident had been quietly improved upon until it featured shouting, fainting, and, in one version, a brief scuffle involving a trombone. At precisely 11:20, nature provided a stabilizing influence in the form of Inspector Purbright, who stood just inside the doorway of the public lavatory and reread the small notebook entry he had made the night before. He found it sensible. The candle, he reflected, had not smelt of anything unusual. The glass had been ordinary, if too resilient. The rainwater had flowed in a perfectly understandable manner. It was the people who had behaved strangely. At that moment Sergeant Lovegrove arrived, damp in the way only policemen are, as though moisture were drawn to the uniform out of professional respect. "Morning, sir." "Morning, Lovegrove. Curious business?" "Indeed. They're saying it was a sort of political thing." "Who is?" "Everyone who hasn't got a better theory." Purbright closed the notebook. "Anyone mention the letters?" Lovegrove blinked. "Letters, sir?" "Mrs. Marrow." "Oh, Lovegrove coughed with an effort at discretion. "She's not mentioned those to anyone we'd call official." "She will," said Purbright mildly. "People who fear disorder fear silence more." They walked slowly towards the square, where the last signs of the event were being coaxed out of existence. A young boy was scraping wax with a spoon for reasons of his own. A pair of women paused mid-step at the sight of the inspector. "Morning," said one with the brightness of a woman who hoped to be asked a question. "Good morning," he replied. "I suppose you're making inquiries?" "I am making observations." They did not find this satisfying. As he moved further into the square, Purbright noticed that despite the cleaning, one thing remained unsettled: a faint, greasy trace where the candle had skidded before coming to rest, a drag mark too neat for water, too narrow for a shoe. He did not comment, he rarely did. At the steps of the memorial, Councillor Bell was supervising with a frown that suggested leadership. "Inspector," Bell said, with relief disguised as authority, "you'll be getting to the bottom of that nonsense." "I find most bottoms reveal themselves," said Purbright, "given time." Bell nodded, not understanding, but approving of anything that sounded patient. Behind him, Mrs. Hargreaves leaned towards Mrs. Tuffin. "I heard," she whispered, "that the flame was blue before it went out." "It wasn't," Mrs. Tuffin whispered back. "I heard it was." "Well then," said Mrs. Tuffin, "it probably was." And somewhere, in a small parlour with too many doilies and too much silence, Mrs. Marrow folded her hands around an empty handbag and decided at last that she would have to speak, which meant that something very soon would have to happen. The town felt it faintly, like the first pressure of thunder behind a cleared sky. Inspector Purbright arrived at the town hall just after midday, the rain having settled into a polite drizzle that allowed umbrellas to be carried decorously rather than brandished like banners. The interior, warmed by a coal fire and the soft hum of conversation, contrasted sharply with the damp chill of the morning. It was in such comfortable surroundings that small-town anxieties tended to reveal themselves most honestly, for politeness softened only so far as one's conscience allowed. He moved slowly through the room, nodding to familiar faces, while his gaze quietly measured the angles of their expressions. Dora Pike, still damp from the morning's walk, greeted him with a slightly tremulous smile. "Inspector," she said, "shall I recount last night's events?" Her hands twisted the edge of her gloves, betraying the meticulous control she usually maintained. "Your observations will be welcome, Miss Pike," Purbright said, his tone neutral, his eyes steady. "But please, in your own words." Dora began carefully, detailing the sequence of events with that habitual attention to decorum which often concealed a sharp memory for the inconsequential. She noted the weather, the brass band, the flickering candles, the glass, the puddles, and finally the scream that had punctuated the evening. She hesitated on Mrs. Marrow's handbag, allowing Purbright to observe her pause rather than press the matter. Every omission, every overemphasis was a thread, and Purbright made mental notes without visible reaction. He then spoke with Mr. Tuffin, the ironmonger, who seemed simultaneously eager to instruct and insult. He repeated the mechanical explanations for the candle's endurance, the peculiar resilience of glass, and the improbable behaviour of the flame. Purbright nodded occasionally, allowing the man's certainty to reveal his insecurities. "And you observed no other unusual elements?" he asked gently. Mr. Tuffin bristled, then conceded that nothing further had escaped notice, though the sharp curve of his lip suggested he felt some discomfort at even admitting that. Across the hall, Councillor Bell busied himself with papers and maps, offering commentary on procedural lapses in municipal planning and suggesting improvements that, in his view, would prevent similar disturbances. Purbright listened, careful not to contradict, noting the eagerness with which Belle assumed that everything, including the behavior of Rain, could be managed by committee. There was a tension beneath the civility, a need to assert order in a town whose chaos had manifested in the simplest of anomalies. Mrs. Hargreaves arrived shortly after, escorted by a companion who whispered details in her ear that she amplified into moral imperatives for all within hearing. She emphasized decorum, the natural order, and the potential scandal, yet offered little in the way of actual facts. Purbright noted that her indignation was strongest where it should have been weakest, a detail he filed for later consideration. Finally, he was directed, politely but firmly, to the library corner of the hall, where Mrs. Marrow had at last emerged from her private arrangements. She appeared composed, though her hands still rested upon an empty handbag, fingers tracing the air where letters had been. Her account was measured, revealing little beyond the distress caused by the loss, yet hints of resentment and preemptive defensiveness shimmered in her tone. Purbright allowed her to speak at length, nodding occasionally, his expression an unbroken mask of courtesy. Throughout, Sergeant Lovegrove lingered nearby, offering clarifications and reminding witnesses of their own statements when necessary. Purbright made careful note of each interjection, recognizing how the subtleties of timing and emphasis could disclose more than any overt declaration. The inspector's mind worked quietly, assembling contradictions and consistencies, though outwardly he betrayed no sense of urgency. Every spoken word, pause, and glance was considered in relation to the others, and each person's unconscious gestures became a puzzle he would later examine in solitude. By late afternoon the accounts were collected, the room had emptied gradually, and Purbright remained behind with Lovegrove, reviewing his notes. The town had provided, in its usual fashion, a wealth of trivialities with which to construct the lattice of human behavior. There had been no spectacular revelations, no dramatic admissions, and yet, in the careful listening and the measured responses of those involved, the first outlines of the evening's oddity were beginning to take shape. The inspector made a mental note to revisit certain remarks, particularly those that were volunteered unnecessarily, and others withheld with studied precision. It was, in its quiet and deliberate way, the beginning of understanding. By the following morning, the town's need for resolution had coalesced with remarkable efficiency. Councillor Bell, ever vigilant in his commitment to order, convened a meeting in the town hall's council chamber, inviting a selection of town dignitaries and anyone who had an opinion sufficiently firm to withstand polite scrutiny. The discussion began in the measured tones appropriate to local government, though the underlying aim was unmistakable: to assign responsibility before further gossip could erode confidence in the municipal apparatus. The obvious suspect, Dora Pike, found herself under gentle, persistent attention. Her reputation for meticulousness, combined with her proximity to the event and an unfortunate tendency to fumble, made her convenient. She did not protest at first, more from surprise than fear. Her habitual politeness constrained her, and the assembled council interpreted her quiet assent as tacit admission. "It seems only natural," said Mr. Tuffin, leaning forward, "that someone so closely involved with the arrangements would inadvertently cause the disruption." His tone was confident, yet not unkind. "Nothing deliberate, of course, merely oversight." Dora adjusted her gloves and shook her head, offering the softest possible correction. "I assure you, Mr. Tuffin, I did not intend any oversight." "Intent is secondary to effect," Councillor Bell interjected, displaying the decisive satisfaction of one convinced that moral clarity can be legislated. The town requires certainty, and certainty demands action. Mrs. Hargreaves, perched on the edge of a chair, nodded in agreement. "And if someone must bear the burden, let it be someone whose habits make the incident plausible. We cannot allow chaos to masquerade as coincidence." Dora, aware that any further protest would sound defensive, maintained her composure. She recounted her precise actions during the ceremony, emphasizing her attentiveness and the steps she had taken to manage the candles. Yet each explanation, delivered in carefully neutral tones, only seemed to underscore her involvement in the minds of others. Purbright observed silently, his hands folded across his coat, permitting the council and assembled citizens to settle on a tidy conclusion without interruption. He noted the eagerness with which people clutched at convenience, a suspect whose presence could be easily linked to the event, whose social position permitted blame without scandal, whose habitual self-discipline would make a minor error plausible. The town sought neatness, and neatness, as he well knew, often concealed truth. Outside the council chamber, the conversation had shifted to whispered conjecture. The women of this parochial organizing committee murmured about Dora's supposed nervousness, embellishing minor stumbles into clear evidence. The men discussed the improbability of a candle burning through rain, interpreting physical anomaly as moral failing. Every recounting gained weight, not through observation, but through repetition. Inside, Mrs. Marrow listened with restrained interest, her hands still hovering over an invisible handbag, as though the letters themselves might materialize from the air. She had made no claim of authorship for the incident, yet the alignment of gossip and conjecture touched her own carefully maintained sense of propriety. One could not deny the importance of appearances in such matters. Purbright, however, had already noted subtleties the council overlooked, the hesitation in Mr. Tuffin's explanations, the slight delay in Dora's responses when asked about specific movements, and the almost imperceptible glances exchanged among Mrs. Hargreaves, Councillor Bell, and a visiting Rotarian who had apparently observed nothing of relevance. These small gestures, when considered together, suggested that the tidy resolution being pursued was provisional at best. By the afternoon, the official record had been drafted, assigning incidental responsibility to Dora Pike, with a note that her actions were unintended and minor. The wording was intended to reassure the town while signalling that order had been restored. Dora read it in silence, her expression polite but composed. She did not argue, but Purbright observed a flicker of subtle calculation behind her calm demeanour. As the meeting dispersed, the inspector lingered for a moment, watching the town's eagerness for closure in action. The neat narrative had been embraced, the obvious suspect assigned, and the machinery of civic propriety had moved efficiently to impose order. Yet Purbright's mind, as always, worked quietly behind the visible sequence, noting inconsistencies, improbable alignments, and the faint traces of human instinct that often outlasted ceremony. It was a comfortable illusion of resolution, he reflected, and the kind that would crumble under gentle, precise scrutiny. The town believed the matter settled. He knew that a further, less obvious detail awaited discovery, one that would unravel the neat pattern before it hardened completely. Until then, he remained politely silent, letting the social machinery of blame perform its predictable ballet. The following morning, the square bore an air of cautious normality. The rain had subsided entirely, leaving behind slick cobblestones that glistened with the faint residue of last night's disturbances. Children, undeterred by recent commotion, slipped and skidded along the uneven stones, and vendors arranged their stalls with the kind of precision that only a small town could sustain, as if the restoration of routine itself might erase memory. Inspector Purbright, taking his customary slow walk through the Wai market, allowed his gaze to settle on a curious detail. Near the base of the war memorial, the faint trail of wax, once discarded by Dora Pike's clumsy handling of the glass candle, remained. It was scarcely more than a thin smear, easily overlooked, but its irregularity drew his attention, Not the path itself, which was predictable, but the subtle twist in the flow of melted wax as it met the cobblestone. A small, almost imperceptible deflection suggested that something had redirected it. A thought, trivial in appearance, began to form. Perhaps the candle had not merely slid by chance. He moved quietly toward the memorial, avoiding the curious glances of townsfolk who were already speculating on the origins of each small imperfection in the square. Each step, deliberate and unhurried, allowed him to observe minutiae: a scuff on a leather shoe, the angle at which a hat had been placed, the way umbrellas were balanced on delicate wrists. These tiny acts of human behavior, so easily ignored, often revealed far more than overt statements. Sergeant Lovegrove joined him, notebook in hand, and noted the wax trail. "It's hardly worth reporting," he said. "Just a bit of debris." Purbright inclined his head. "Nothing in Weatherby is so trivial as it appears." He crouched, letting his fingers hover just above the hardened wax without touching it, as if acknowledging its significance silently. Across the square, Dora Pike was conducting her own private inspection, retrieving small fragments of glass from where they had fallen and placing them in her purse with the precision of one cataloguing evidence, though she did so under the guise of tidying. Her eyes lifted occasionally to meet the inspector's, polite, unassuming, and yet hinting at a subtle wariness that he noted but did not comment upon. Nearby, Mrs. Hargreaves had gathered a small audience around the remains of the fallen candle, offering a detailed reconstruction that had grown in her mind overnight. "It slid," she said, nodding, and then, quite unexpectedly, it continued to burn. Her voice was low, awed. "It must have been deliberate, surely." Purbright made no reply. He allowed the conjecture to expand naturally, noting the way each listener tilted their head, how their expressions flickered between incredulity and suspicion. In human behavior, he found, such small reactions often carried the weight of confession. He then glanced toward the memorial steps, noticing a tiny smudge where Mrs. Marrow had previously rested her handbag. The letters, long vanished, had left no physical trace, yet the slight imprint of leather and faint residue of wax spoke to a sequence of events carefully concealed beneath civility. The combination of wax smear and handbag mark produced a pattern that, while innocuous to the casual observer, hinted at movement, intention, and perhaps opportunity. Later, in the town library, Purbright consulted old municipal records tracing the history of previous ceremonies and noting the habitual patterns of participants. There were discrepancies, subtle enough to evade notice, yet consistent with the minor disruptions of the current event. It was the sort of detail most people overlooked entirely, yet it held weight when one considered human nature, habit, and the careful cultivation of appearances. By afternoon he had visited the key witnesses again, observing the minutiae of their reactions under casual questioning. A glance too long, a hesitation too brief, or the slightly defensive curl of a lip provided insight into motives that otherwise remained hidden. Each person, he noted, believed themselves cleverer than they were, assuming that politeness concealed thought, when in fact politeness often amplified the truth beneath. The wax, the dropped glass, the empty handbag, each detail seemed trivial alone, yet in combination they suggested a quiet orchestration rather than mere accident. Purbright made careful, almost imperceptible notes, his mind threading together the implications of gestures, small errors, and human frailty. He did not speak, yet every observation sharpened the outline of what had, until then, seemed an unremarkable incident. As the day waned, the market square emptied and the lamps flickered on, casting long shadows over the glistening cobbles. The town, unaware of the connections forming under Purbright's scrutiny, prepared for the evening's tea and social calls, confident in its restored order. The inspector, however, understood that beneath this veneer of normality, subtle threads were converging toward a truth that few would anticipate, one that hinged not on dramatic declarations, but on the quiet persistence of a small flame, stubbornly defiant even in rain. By mid-morning, the town's streets hummed with the usual quiet activity, though beneath the surface, minor tensions began to make themselves known. Shopkeepers exchanged glances over counters, their smiles polite, but edged with suspicion. Conversations, carefully pitched to avoid offence, nevertheless carried subtle insinuations. Every citizen seemed alert to the unseen currents that ran beneath Weatherby and Marsh's outwardly decorous surface. Inspector Purbright observed from the corner of the market square, noting how people arranged themselves physically and socially. Mrs. Hargreaves lingered near the bakery, offering commentary on yesterday's events to anyone willing to listen. Her voice, tempered by concern but sharpened by judgment. Her words, innocuous as they appeared, carried undertones that hinted at long-standing grievances. The bakery proprietor, Mr. Trenwith, nodded along, betraying faint irritation that suggested a history of minor slights and accumulated resentment. In the library, Purbright reviewed civic correspondence, letters and notes that had been filed away, seemingly trivial but revealing subtle interpersonal dynamics. One note concerned a dispute over seating, arrangements at last year's floral exhibition. Another recorded Mrs. Marrow's quiet indignation at an overzealous committee member. These minor irritations, he reflected, often festered into covert manoeuvrings, and Weatherby and Marsh was fertile ground for such discreet politicking. Meanwhile, Mrs. Marrow had arranged for tea in her parlour, inviting a select few under the guise of discussion on charitable matters. Purbright arrived as a guest of necessity, politely accepted and unobtrusive, allowing the conversation to flow. The remarks were measured, courteous, yet each speaker's tone and choice of anecdote betrayed subtle hostilities. Miss Pike referenced past mishaps, carefully phrased to suggest negligence without accusation. Mr. Tuffin, ever meticulous, inserted technical observations that implied an almost deliberate irregularity in prior events. The inspector listened, noting contradictions between statements and previous accounts. He paid attention to pauses, inflections, and gestures, the tilt of a head, the twitch of a hand, the momentary tightening of lips. These were the invisible threads weaving stories more truthful than the polished words themselves. Outside, the market square witnessed minor confrontations, a disagreement over stall placement, a dispute regarding a delivery schedule, a muttered complaint about early morning noise. Each seemed trivial, yet Purbright observed how such matters resonated with personal histories, revealing loyalties, resentments, and subtle manipulations. He recognized how patterns of small indignities could accumulate, forming the basis for actions that appeared spontaneous, yet were quietly calculated. By afternoon, additional characters emerged from the background. Mr. Harcourt, a retired solicitor, lingered near the war memorial with a diary in hand, making notes on public behaviour. Miss Linton, who ran the local drapery, whispered observations to a neighbour regarding the peculiarities of Mr. Tuffin's reactions and the apparent discomfort of Councillor Bell. Even minor figures, normally invisible in public life, contributed to the intricate social web, each remark layered with implication. Purbright, now seated in his office with a steaming cup of tea, reviewed his notes. The evidence was not in crime or confession, but in subtle human tendencies, rivalries, petty jealousy, concealed resentments. The candle, the glass, and the vanished letters were catalysts that had exposed these underlying currents. He pondered the alignment of these social forces, recognizing how minor provocations and small slights could combine into a situation of quiet disorder, imperceptible to casual observers, yet crucial to understanding the event fully. By evening, as the lamplight cast long shadows across cobblestones and shuttered windows, the inspector reflected on the complexity beneath Wetherby and Marsh's serene exterior. The town's respectable surface concealed a lattice of grievances, loyalties, and minor manipulations. Each person, he knew, acted according to habit and instinct, their social armor shaped by years of observation and caution. Beneath politeness lay calculation. Beneath civility lay motives not always openly acknowledged. Purbright concluded his reflections with the familiar satisfaction of a man beginning to see patterns where others perceived randomness. The ordinary, he knew, often contained the extraordinary if one attended to the subtle signals beneath respectability. And in Wetherby and Marsh, the extraordinary had quietly revealed itself through the smallest, most inconspicuous actions. Late the following morning, Wetherby and Marsh experienced another subtle disruption, one less spectacular than the candle, but equally disconcerting in its implications. At the railway buffet, Mr. Trenwith discovered that a small, carefully prepared tray of pastries had vanished entirely, leaving only a scattering of crumbs and a faint smear of icing on the counter. The incident was so minor that most customers barely noticed, yet those attuned to the town's quiet anxieties felt an immediate ripple of unease. Word of the disappearance spread quickly, as it invariably did in a town where attention to detail was considered both civic duty and entertainment. Mrs. Hargreaves, whose awareness of events bordered on professional, leaned across the counter to inform the station master that someone had, in her estimation, deliberately removed the pastries as a form of subtle provocation. The station master nodded politely, more out of habit than conviction, and murmured that such acts were most irregular. Meanwhile, Dora Pike arrived at the buffet with a basket of her own, intending to procure tea and a scone. She paused at the sight of the empty tray, her lips tightening for a moment, though she made no overt complaint. Purbright, who had accompanied her out of curiosity and courtesy, observed this silent reaction carefully. The timing of her glance, the slight hesitation in her step, suggested nothing incriminating on its surface. Yet, as ever, the subtleties of behavior often revealed more than words. Across the room, Councillor Bell had already begun whispering to Mr. Tuffin, his tone low and conspiratorial. "You see, it is never simple," he murmured. "The first incident seemed accidental, but now there is pattern." Tuffin nodded, allowing a small frown to crease his forehead, though whether at the remark or at the pastry theft was unclear. Their conversation, seemingly innocuous, allowed Purbright to note the intersection of perception and assumption. The town was quick to impose order upon disorder, even when causality remained unestablished. At a corner table, Mrs. Marrow quietly extracted a notebook from her handbag, noting the event with her customary precision. The letters that had vanished days before were absent from her purview, but the residue of their importance lingered, colouring her interpretations of minor disturbances. She remarked to no one in particular that some disruptions, though trivial, spoke to underlying carelessness or intention, depending upon one's perspective. Purbright, observing the subtle tightness of her fingers around the notebook, filed the gesture carefully. By mid-morning, the initial suspect, Dora Pike, was, in some circles, being reconsidered. The new occurrence introduced doubt. If she had been responsible for the candle, would she also orchestrate this minor theft? The notion seemed improbable to the discerning observer, yet it was precisely the kind of conclusion a town eager for resolution might seize. Murmurs in the street suggested alternative explanations: mislaid trays, absent-minded staff, or the whims of some unknown interloper. Purbright, however, noted a finer detail. The crumbs followed a trajectory inconsistent with accidental spillage. The icing smear, though faint, suggested deliberate handling, a movement constrained and careful rather than clumsy. The evidence was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet when combined with the prior anomalies, the resilient candle, the misplaced glass, the empty handbag, it suggested a connected pattern, one invisible to all but the most attentive observer. By afternoon he had discreetly questioned the buffet staff, noting the hesitations and qualifications in their responses. Each remark, each slight contradiction was filed in the inspector's mind, adding nuance to a developing picture. Human nature, he reflected, rarely yielded to straightforward interpretation. It often communicated through the pauses between words, the direction of a gaze, the careful modulation of politeness. As the day drew to a close, the town's conversation had shifted once more, the second disturbance lending fresh momentum to gossip while undermining confidence in the earlier, tidy resolution. Dora remained silent, polite, and unobtrusive, allowing suspicion and exoneration alike to swirl without interference. Purbright, ever patient, observed the patterns emerging, aware that the first neat conclusion had been unsettled, and that the hidden logic of events was beginning to reveal itself in quiet, deliberate increments. By evening, the railway buffet was empty, save for a few lingering crumbs and the faint aroma of tea, and the town, unaware of the inspector's quiet deductions, prepared to close another day. Beneath its orderly surface, however, small inconsistencies and subtle threads of human behavior had begun to coalesce, and Purbright recognized that the solution, when it emerged, would not be found in obvious gestures, but in the careful reading of what was intentionally and unintentionally concealed. That evening, as Weatherby and Marsh settled into the gentle hum of lamps and shutters, Inspector Purbright retired to the quiet of his study. The room, modestly furnished and suffused with the faint aroma of paper and coal smoke, offered a sanctuary where the town's complexities could be considered without interruption. He poured himself a cup of tea, the motion deliberate, and allowed his thoughts to return to the subtle disturbances that had marked the previous days. He reflected on the candle, its persistence in rain, a small but telling defiance of expectation. The glass, resilient yet ordinary, the wax, its smears tracing curious paths, the letters, vanished yet weighty in implication. Each element, seemingly isolated, now formed a network of minutiae through which human behavior could be traced. The ordinary, he mused, concealed extraordinary layers when one observed with sufficient patience. The railway buffet incident, trivial as it seemed, revealed similar patterns: crumbs, traces of icing, gestures and hesitations, all communicated intentions and tendencies not readily acknowledged in polite society. Observing such small details, Purbright had begun to see how the town's calm exterior masked undercurrents of rivalry, resentment, and subtle manipulation. Respectable facades, he knew, rarely reflected the fullness of motive. They were constructed to mislead, even inadvertently, and only careful, attentive scrutiny could reveal the underlying logic. He considered the inhabitants individually and collectively. Mrs. Hargreaves, with her moral certainties and keen observation, acted as both instigator and amplifier of town gossip. Councillor Bell's insistence on order often obscured his own minor failings, while Mr. Tuffin's meticulousness hinted at an anxiety that could manifest unpredictably. Dora Pike's outward composure, though admirable, contained faint traces of tension at specific prompts. Even Mrs. Marrow, with her vanished letters and exacting manners, provided subtle cues to human foibles that ordinary eyes would overlook. Purbright allowed himself to consider the interplay of motive and opportunity, noting how small slights, minor rivalries, and habitual decorum intersected. In Weatherby and Marsh, as in most towns, truth rarely announced itself. Instead, it revealed itself in hesitations, in unintended gestures, in choices of timing, phrasing, and emphasis. The polite silences, he realized, were often as revealing as speech. The measured words carried subtext that the town's inhabitants, blinded by social niceties, seldom noticed. He reviewed his notes from the past week, tracing the threads of events with methodical attention. Patterns emerged: the positioning of people, the timing of gestures, the choice of words, the alignment of minor incidents. Each observation reinforced the idea that what had been dismissed as coincidence or triviality was in fact a tapestry of deliberate and inadvertent actions intertwined. Purbright then reflected on human nature itself. People sought order, but their impulses were rarely straightforward. They cultivated appearances, guarded secrets, and operated within social codes that obscured intention. In small towns, he knew, these dynamics were magnified. Every action, no matter how insignificant, could ripple outward, influencing perception and behavior in ways that were not immediately obvious. By late evening, as the lamps dimmed and the shadows lengthened, Purbright's mind was quiet but active. He had begun to map the subtleties, the tensions, the hidden motives that linked the candle, the glass, the letters, and the pastries. The town's facade of civility remained intact, yet beneath it, the quiet architecture of human behavior revealed itself to him in precise, delicate patterns. He sipped his tea, allowing the private logic of the evening to settle, confident that the next steps of observation would soon bring the final strands into focus. The following afternoon, Inspector Purbright arranged a quiet meeting in Mrs. Marrow's parlour, ostensibly to discuss the town's upcoming charitable lecture. The room, with its neat rows of porcelain and carefully ironed doilies, provided the perfect setting: domestic, respectable, and subtly authoritative. He had invited a few key figures, Dora Pike, Councillor Bell, and Mr. Tuffin, under the guise of ordinary conversation, while the true aim remained invisible to all. The conversation began with innocuous remarks about weather, market routines, and civic scheduling. Purbright spoke with his usual mildness, allowing each participant to contribute freely. Every response, every hesitation, every careful selection of words was observed. The inspector's attention, however, focused on the smallest inconsistencies, the micro pauses, the slight changes in tone, the angles of gaze when a particular subject was broached. At one point he mentioned, almost casually, the candle and its peculiar behavior during the rain. He allowed the phrase to linger in the air without further comment, noting the subtle shifts in posture and expression that followed. Dora Pike's fingers tightened briefly around her teacup. Councillor Bell blinked more than usual, and Mr. Tuffin's jaw flexed almost imperceptibly. Such minor reactions, though unremarkable individually, collectively suggested discomfort with the topic. Purbright then moved, with the utmost politeness, to refer to the railway buffet and the missing pastries. Again, he allowed the observation to hang, phrased as an idle curiosity rather than accusation. The participants adjusted themselves, exchanged faint glances, and offered explanations with careful neutrality. Yet each explanation, measured and seemingly casual, betrayed traces of anxiety when compared with prior accounts. Throughout, the inspector remained mild-mannered, his voice even, his expressions unremarkable. There was no overt pressure, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, he relied on the natural instincts of his guests. Politeness, the desire to appear composed, and the instinct to conceal embarrassment. Each person, without realizing it, revealed subtle truths in the very act of maintaining civility. Mrs. Marrow, for her part, sipped her tea with deliberate calm, yet her hands flexed slightly when the subject of letters was mentioned. Purbright allowed her to continue, making no interruption, observing instead the small cues of tension, a glance that lingered too long, a faint stiffening of posture. Human behavior, he reflected often, carried confessions in silence. By carefully sequencing his remarks and allowing each participant's natural tendencies to emerge, Purbright had created a situation in which the guilty party would, without direct accusation, betray themselves. It was a delicate mechanism, an interplay of observation, timing, and the quiet application of social pressure. The others, unaware of the underlying design, continued their polite discourse, unwittingly exposing inconsistencies, oversights, and minor evasions that pointed toward the truth. As the tea cooled and conversation meandered toward unrelated topics, the inspector noted, with discreet satisfaction, the subtle indications of internal unease. He did not speak, did not prompt, he simply observed. In such civilized surroundings, the act of careful attention was often more revealing than direct interrogation, and by exploiting the town's own adherence to etiquette, he had engineered a small but telling disruption. By evening, the meeting drew to a close. Each guest departed with their reputation intact, believing they had navigated the afternoon without compromise. Purbright, however, had gathered sufficient insight. Gestures, glances, hesitations, and over-precise politeness had all been recorded in his mind. The groundwork for the ultimate revelation was now complete, the subtle trap having extracted from civility the evidence that circumstance alone had failed to produce. The following morning, Purbright invited the key participants to Mrs. Marrow's parlour once more, this time under the pretext of reviewing the arrangements for the coming charity lecture. The room was quiet, orderly, and suffused with the soft morning light that passed through the lace curtains, creating a sense of calm suitable for careful reflection. The inspector allowed the tea to be served, noting the habitual small gestures, Dora Pike's meticulous alignment of cups, Councillor Bell's arrangement of papers, and Mr. Tuffin's slight adjustment of his posture as he settled in. These, as always, were clues that he observed without comment. He began with a gentle recollection of the events that had troubled the town. The memorial candle that defied rain, the unusual slide of the glass, the vanished letters, and the missing pastries at the railway buffet. Each element was stated plainly, without emphasis, allowing the participants to follow a natural narrative thread while retaining the guise of ordinary conversation. As you may recall, Purbright said, each of these incidents seemed at first to be independent, yet upon reflection, certain consistencies emerge. He paused, allowing the words to settle, and observed the subtle tightening of grips on teacups, the imperceptible shifts in seating, the momentary hesitation of speech. The candle, for instance, did not merely resist extinguishment. Its trajectory and the slight deflection of wax indicate external guidance rather than coincidence. He spoke of the glass, the faint mark of a hand that had redirected it, and of the letters that had vanished from Mrs. Marrow's handbag, tracing their influence upon subsequent interactions. The conversation proceeded calmly, almost academically, yet each detail pinpointed human intervention and motive. He spoke of the railway buffet not as a crime scene, but as a further illustration of intention, noting how the crumbs and icing smears suggested deliberate movement. Purbright then drew the participants' attention to behavioral evidence, the slight discrepancies in accounts, the hesitation in replies, the very gestures meant to convey civility, but that betrayed internal unease. He carefully illustrated how these small, often overlooked details connected the incidents, revealing a chain of actions consistent with one person's involvement. Dora Pike's composure, measured and polite throughout, faltered only in imperceptible micro-expressions when her attention returned to the candle and glass. Councillor Bell's habitual insistence on order had inclined him to favour neat resolutions, yet even he could not escape the clarity of the chain once it was delineated. Mr. Tuffin, meticulous to the point of discomfort, exhibited a subtle acknowledgment in the stiffening of posture, a silent concession that the logic presented was sound. Finally, Purbright turned to Mrs. Marrow. "Your letters," he said, "while not themselves a cause, precipitated responses that shaped subsequent actions. It was not malice nor neglect, but the interplay of human caution and curiosity that allowed events to unfold as they did." His tone remained neutral, almost conversational, yet precise in its delineation of cause and effect. One by one, the participants absorbed the explanation, the clarity of logic, rendering polite defenses unnecessary. There were no raised voices, no dramatics. The truth settled gently into the minds of those present, as inevitable and composed as the morning light that filled the room. In the incidents were now comprehensible, the pattern of minor provocations and deliberate actions evident, and the town's disturbances understood in the context of habit, intention, and human nature. As the meeting concluded, the inspector rose with quiet civility, leaving behind an atmosphere of subdued reflection. The guests departed, their expressions a mixture of relief, surprise, and newfound comprehension. Wetherby and Marsh, the town itself, would carry forward with its routines, subtly aware that even the most innocuous appearances could conceal careful design, and that civility often masks deeper undercurrents. By late afternoon, Wetherby and Marsh had resumed the measured cadence of its usual life, as if the previous week's peculiarities had been little more than a passing drizzle rather than a subtle disruption of its careful routines. Shopkeepers adjusted their displays with an extra flourish, perhaps unconsciously affirming that civility and order had returned. The square, now thoroughly washed and swept, reflected the soft glow of a declining sun, which lent a calmness that contrasted with the understated tension of earlier days. Mrs. Hargreaves, having shared the inspector's explanation with a select audience, seemed satisfied that moral propriety had been vindicated. Her commentary, once sharp and speculative, had softened into the reassuring cadence of someone pleased to have clarity restored. Mr. Tuffin returned to his ironmongery with his habitual precision, straightening tools and adjusting shelving, confident that any suspicion cast upon him had been dispelled. Councillor Bell, after reviewing the formal notes, nodded at the meticulous unfolding of events, content that the town's order had been preserved and that the neatness he so valued was reinforced. Dora Pike, discreetly diligent, resumed her routines with a quiet composure, her previous moments of hesitation now understood in light of the inspector's observations. She moved among the high street and parlour rooms with careful grace, aware of the subtle scrutiny still inherent in small-town attention, yet reassured by the calm resolution that Purbright's explanation had brought. Mrs. Marrow, having reflected on the fate of her letters and the gentle guidance of circumstances, allowed herself the rare gesture of relaxation, arranging her writing materials in precise order, while acknowledging silently the role her private actions had played in revealing deeper truths. She poured tea with measured care, the ritual serving both as consolation and confirmation that propriety remained intact. Purbright, meanwhile, retreated to the quiet of his office, preferring solitude to social exchange. He reviewed the notes, the wax smears, the missing pastries, the glass, and the behavioral cues, each element now assembled into a coherent narrative. He reflected on the subtleties of human nature, the small impulses, concealed rivalries, and polite deceptions that had shaped the incidents. In Wetherby and Marsh, civility often concealed motive, but when attended to carefully, it revealed as much as any overt action. The inspector allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, acknowledging the precise balance between human error and intention that had orchestrated the sequence of disturbances. The town, blissfully unaware of the delicate observations that had guided understanding, would continue its routines with an enhanced sense of security. The events of the past days folded neatly into memory as instructive yet contained anomalies. As evening deepened, the streets quieted and lamps cast pools of gentle light over cobblestones still glistening faintly from earlier rain. Wetherby and Marsh had endured its small turmoil with civility intact, subtle shifts in awareness quietly preserved in the minds of its inhabitants. Inspector Purbright, satisfied with the restoration of order, returned to paperwork, his presence in the town as unobtrusive as the lessons he had discerned, content that the layers of human behavior had been read, understood, and acknowledged without unnecessary spectacle.